Welcome to the Oz Fishing Game podcast. My name is Luke, and today I'll be discussing the New South Wales Greens firearm policy. I'll start off by reading a quote from Ms. Pennacook, a member of the Greens Party. The new NFA does make some inroads into clamping down on unsafe storage of firearms as well, because even those sporting shooters, or shooting advocates, say that the real problem is illegal firearms. In fact, it is stolen firearms which become illegal firearms. The police have been reporting for several years now that they are finding firearms in vehicles on a routine basis, and this is of concern. So in fact, we do need the National Firearms Agreement. We do need more stringent gun control laws in Australia. Having said that, we will not be supporting the amendment put forward by Ms. Pulford. That is not to say we do not support the National Firearms Agreement in principle, even though, as I've already outlined, we would like to see more strict provisions on it. End quote. That statement was made on the 22nd of March 2017. I think it accurately sums up the overall goals towards legal firearms ownership. Little by little, inch by inch, take more and more. In this document, the Greens Firearm Policy, they frame their intentions as matching the NFA, the National Firearms Agreement, as written in 1996. But that previous quote proves otherwise. Many of the points in this document apply to other states outside of New South Wales. Unless otherwise stated, I'll address them from a New South Wales point of view. Let's begin. Principles. The Greens New South Wales believe 1. Public firearms policy should be concerned with the prevention of firearms violence and be directed towards the removal of objects that cause injury and death. I'll split this one into two parts. Public firearms policy should be concerned with the prevention of firearms violence. Yes, I agree. And the removal of objects that cause injury and death. For criminals, yes, no one is arguing against that. For law-abiding firearms owners? No. If the Greens are going to pursue the goal of removing firearms from all people, which is their intent, how far do they extend our state or country's legislation in order to protect ourselves against harm? Cars, knives, objects that inflict blunt force trauma, each of these have a substantially higher rate of harm than firearms. Mental health and suicide are often drawn into the firearms debate, despite no proven correlation. So at what point do they apply the same level of attention to other external factors? Should we require licence, training, or additional government oversight to social media? Should we outright ban it? After all, there is a proven correlation between its usage, violent confrontations, and self-harm. Hunters are often asked to draw the line when it comes to what type of animal they'll eat. So I'll ask the Greens to do the same, not only for this line of policy, but for the entire document. Draw the line. How far are you prepared to go in the pursuit of harm minimisation? How many lives must be lost before you decide that something is a worthwhile cause to intervene? 1, 50, 1,000? Feel free to drop me an email at ozfishinggame@gmail.com or leave a comment below. I'm curious about what number you land on and what policies you would implement to stand by this figure. 2. Public policy should be underpinned by World Health Organization standards and resolutions outlined by the Australasian Police Ministers' Council, Council Agreement on Firearms. According to the World Health Organization Report on Injuries and Violence, 19th of March 2021, I quote, of the 4.4 million injury-related deaths, unintentional injuries take the lives of 3.16 million every year, and violence-related injuries kill 1.25 million people every year. Roughly 1 in 3 of these deaths result from road traffic crashes, 1 in 6 from suicide, 1 in 10 from homicide, and 1 in 61 from war and conflict. If we would like to follow the World Health Organization's own reports, if this isn't solely an agenda-based attack on firearms owners, why are we not addressing these factors which cause the highest rate of fatalities first? And why are firearms always at the top of the list? In a perfect world, a utopia, we can flick the light switch and prevent all violence. But that world does not and will not ever exist. You cannot force your will onto another person and control their reaction. As a result, violence and hate will be still prevalent in the community, as will spontaneous acts of violence. The road rules are a prime example of this. The majority of us hold a car license, car is registered, we have insurance, and we follow the rules. Yet the minority ruin it for everybody. Drunk driving, road rage, speeding, no insurance registration, or operating a vehicle while using a mobile device. The cause of these actions is not the car's fault. It's not the bottle of whiskey, and it's not the phone. It's the lack of discipline, care, and self-control from the individual. Now, should we strengthen the fines for non-compliance? Sure, we can do that. Will it affect the outcome? No, it won't. A few weeks ago, a BMW driver was speeding through Sydney and had a head-on collision with a Lexus. The male driver of the BMW had been caught on 5 previous occasions without a licence. His failure to do the right thing caused injuries to a woman and 3 young girls. While individual responsibility comes into play here, I think it highlights the failure of our court system. Legislation alone does nothing to prevent harm. As for the Australasian Police Ministers' Council Agreement on Firearms, from my understanding this is a reference to the National Firearms Agreement of '96. I won't go through this document piece by piece, as many of the key points are addressed throughout this document anyway. Number 3. The availability of firearms contributes to violence in our society. Greens, let me adjust this wording for you. The availability of firearms to criminals contributes to violence in our society. There's no overlooking that fact. Now, if we want to discuss injury or death at the hands of licensed firearm owners, this becomes an entirely different conversation. That is, a lack of mental health support and the demonisation of those who are suffering through a mental health crisis. We'll discuss how you can improve mental health support later in this podcast, but right now, we'll focus on domestic violence and suicide, which involve firearms. Despite its rare occurrence, it remains an issue. That's why we need to introduce a constructive program aimed at prevention. Let me introduce you to a concept which was developed in North America, entitled, Just Fucking Ask. Let me explain. There's an organisation called the Overwatch Project, whose primary focus is set on suicide and harm prevention. Many of the original programs were designed to assist veterans with mental health issues, PTSD, and firearms ownership. It has also been applied successfully to their civilian population. Here's a very condensed version of how it works. The Overwatch Project provides education and training on mental health and firearm safety. These courses are offered to veterans, their families, friends, and members of the community. Armed with strategies to assist those who may be experiencing a mental health crisis, they seek out people who may be at risk of suicide and have a respectful and non-judgmental conversation about it. Part of that conversation includes the pact. Hey, if I'm ever suffering from a mental health crisis, can you promise me that you'll secure my firearms, keep them locked away in your safe, until I pursue a professional help and level back out? It might seem like an awkward conversation, but the response on many occasions will be yes. The person then follows up that initial question with this. If you're in the same position, can you promise me that you'll reach out to me so I can secure your firearms and provide you with the same level of support? Again, it may seem odd, but most people will reciprocate, as the favour has been asked of them in the first place. What they've established during this conversation is an agreement which forms the basis of a mental health plan. This will ensure that firearms are safely secured in the event of a mental health crisis. Should this situation ever occur, it won't come as a shock to the affected party when a request is made to temporarily remove firearms from their custody in order to keep themselves and their family safe. The beauty of his plan is that it removes some of the key barriers to seek help. That is, the fear of police intervention and the fear of having firearms permanently confiscated. Instead, it provides incentive for people to seek help and start the healing process. That should be the goal of mental health, not the demonisation of the individual. Now, for this to work, we'd obviously need to allow licensed individuals to be able to store firearms in their safe, even if registered in other people's names. Based upon my understanding, it's not possible in a few Australian states. How do you minimise the risk of domestic violence involving firearms? Start by updating your legislation and refer to the tagline, "Just fucking ask." It's a good start. Number 4. There must be a holistic approach to preventing gun violence, including 4.1. Tough legislation to reduce firearms ownership. There has been no proven correlation between legal firearms ownership and violence, nor has there between the legal ownership of firearms and involvement in criminal activities. As such, there's no credible reason to take this approach. If anything, the mountain of legislative changes made since 1996 and the consistent levels of violent crime demonstrate that a tough stance on gun control doesn't work. If you're interested in a system that does work, I recommend that you check out Switzerland, but that's a conversation for another day. 4.2. Education on the dangers of firearms. Education on the dangers. That includes basic firearm safety and awareness training for all young Australians. You can count me in. I'll even dedicate some of my time to help out with course design. Sadly, I think this education will be more fear-porn propaganda to boost the credibility of the Greens anti-gun stance. So, which would be a better outcome? You tell me. In my experience, some of the most trustworthy and safety-conscious firearms owners I've ever met were farmers. Why is that? Because they've grown up around firearms. To them, a firearm is a tool like any other. They are well and truly past the novelty stage of having one around, and at that stage in their life, they were kept under the direct supervision and control of a licensed adult while handling the firearm. 4.3. Long-term funding for programs that help to reduce gun violence. We've addressed this a great program already, back in Policy 3. Just fucking ask, the Overwatch project. Check it out. 4.4. Support for intelligence-based policing to prevent firearm crime. I couldn't find a definition for intelligence-based policing online, but what I did find was intelligence-led policing. According to the article that I read, it's a collaborative enterprise based on improved intelligence operations in community-oriented policing and problem-solving. That's pretty fucking vague. How far does intelligence-led policing go? Well, based on recent legislative changes, police now have the power to access, add, remove, or edit content on your social media accounts. So there's not much privacy left anyway. The old saying, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about, tends to come up in these conversations. But conveniently, the concept of corruption and misuse of power tends to be overlooked. Even if you don't agree with me on this one, let's pretend that this concept wasn't ridiculous for a second. Ask yourself this: how well does a current version of this system actually work? How often do you hear about a drug dealer, domestic violence perpetrator, or a terrorist being flagged as a concern with police? Answer: more often than not. Despite this, the Greens would be more happy for firearms owners to be profiled as a person of interest, despite having no criminal history. Yet when it comes to our First Nations people, they're explicitly against this type of approach. Why the inconsistent policies, guys? 4.5. Ongoing funding for research into preventing gun violence. On face value, it sounds like a pretty reasonable policy. Well, it would be, if most of the research surrounding gun control wasn't agenda-driven and skewed to discredit the case for legal firearms ownership. As we all know, these findings form a basis for the mainstream media's anti-gun rhetoric, which in turn creates easy political point scoring. There's a brilliant video around skewed firearms data as analysed by a statistician on YouTube. If I can find the link, I'll post it in the description below. Point 5. The aims and tactics of the gun lobby must be publicly exposed. First and foremost, we don't have a registered firearms lobby group within Australia. They often consider the Sports Shooters Association of Australia, the SSAA, as the NRA of Australia. But the SSAA have said themselves they're not a lobby group. There are occasions when they do step up to the plate to help out, but that's only when it supports their own business goals. There are some organisations out there who have made solid strides in supporting firearms owners. The National Shooting Council, Shooters Union, and CIFA are prime examples. But I don't think that's what's being referred to here. As far as aims go, if the Greens had bothered to listen to those who represent us, they would have a clear understanding of what we want. Most agree, that is, to maintain many of the reasonable checks and balances for firearms ownership, to access semi-automatic rifles and pump-action shotguns for our approved genuine reasons, suppressors to act as additional hearing protection, hunting in national parks, and overall, less 1080 baiting and helicopter culls. It's pretty straightforward. While we're on the topic of hunting in national parks, why not offer a short ballot period during the rut with finances directed towards hunter-led conservation efforts? Remove pest animals, support the environment. It's a win-win. 6. Rural owners of licensed firearms should limit the use of firearms to legitimate farm purposes and minimise disturbance of people on neighbouring properties. When I first read this policy statement, I took it in on face value. I thought that it was solely aimed at farmers who may have invited some young boys onto the property to blink some targets, throw some clays or hunt some deer. It wasn't until I came back to this point that I realised that it's actually about something else. Closing down approved firearms ranges. After all, the only people who are inconvenienced by prolonged and consistent firearms noise are those who live in near proximity to these ranges. And to those people, I'll say this. If you did your due diligence when purchasing the property, you would be aware that the pre-existing shooting range was located close by. Same thing applies here with firearms as it does elsewhere. I don't care if you moved underneath the flight path in Western Sydney, into a suburb with a motorsports complex, or down the road from a local pub that plays live music. If you purchase a property and proactively attempt to shut down a well-established local institution, you're a piece of shit. On that note, if we had community support for suppressors, it might be less of an issue. Point 7. That personal protection should never be regarded as a genuine reason for owning, possessing, or using a firearm. Who does this statement apply to? Does it fit in with the recent narrative of defunding the police? Was it about the forceful transition towards non-lethal tactics, despite context of the situation? Or is this policy aimed squarely at the average Joe? I don't know. But I will say this, police and private security contractors are everyday people. Generally speaking, many have less firearms handling experience and are less proficient than the average firearms owner. So with the exception of a job title, what makes them any more responsible than myself or any other person? Nothing. On the subject of personal protection, here's a fun fact for you. Did you know that a ballistic or bulletproof vest is considered a prohibited weapon in Australia? That a stab-proof vest requires a special permit. There's been some interesting photos recently floating around with Dan Andrews wearing what appears to be a ballistic vest, and it's got me thinking. Has anyone cited his prohibited weapons permit for this item? If firearms are still a problem after 26 years of gun control policy, if the general public is placed at such a high risk that we need to place further restrictions on firearms ownership, why are we not able to purchase a ballistic vest for our own protection? Sure, criminals will be able to get hold of them, but that's no different than the estimated 260,000 unregistered firearms that are already on the streets. That's one firearm per 108 people in Australia. Let that sink in. Moving down to the policy detail, the Greens New South Wales will work towards number 8. Legislation which brings New South Wales laws into line with the 1996 Australian Police Ministers' Agreement on Firearms. We've touched on this point in number 2 earlier, so we're going to skip over this one. Number 9. Total ban on the ownership, importation and use of semi-automatic firearms. Contrary to the narrative, semi-automatic weapons serve a valuable purpose. Pest control, animal management, hunting, and if you paid attention to the invasion of Ukraine, or if you've been watching the current election campaigns, the use in national defence. Some may call it a racist, fear-mongering campaign against China, while others may think it's a wild conspiracy theory. Nonetheless, it appears to be a valid concern in the eyes of our leading politicians. So what sense does it make to outright ban access to these firearms? Goodwill and the best of intentions are not an adequate national defence policy. In terms of our current legislation, where are we at now? The current level of bureaucracy makes it difficult to import these items, even with the proper licence and paperwork. To acquire a Category C or D licence, a person must have an occupational requirement to obtain that category of firearm. They must undergo more thorough background checks. They must have a safe which is built to a higher standard and have it regularly inspected. And from my understanding, some states even require fingerprints to be taken. In my opinion, that approach is far more restrictive than what is necessary. Point 10. An improved firearms registration system in New South Wales. The word improved is a matter of perspective. So I'll ask the question. Given the opportunity, how would you improve the firearms registration system? Would you make it more streamlined? This could free up resources which could be better utilised elsewhere. We could add additional safeguards to prevent accidental release of registered firearm owners' details. This would reduce the potential for theft and the violence associated with break-in enters. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the goal here. I think improved means slower, more restrictive, and perhaps allow more access to our records by community-minded organisations that hold the anti-firearms ownership stance. But who knows? I can only speculate on this one. Number 11. Improved cooperation between the New South Wales Government and other levels of government in Australia to strengthen national uniform gun laws, firearms training, and a national register of firearms. Again, this is about implementing an outdated national firearms agreement, or a harsher and more restrictive version of it. We've already addressed that point. As for the National Register of Firearms, I'm based in New South Wales. What purpose does it serve to have my firearms licence status and a list of my registered firearms made available to someone on the other side of the country? We could argue that maybe the WA Police would like to check the validity of my licence if I'm visiting for a hunting trip. But that's redundant when you take into account that a cancelled licence would result in both my physical licence and my firearms being removed from my possession. If I have no intention of travelling interstate with my firearms, why would it matter anyway? WA Police Force don't hold jurisdiction here. If they have intelligence which suggests that I've done something wrong, they must pass that on to the New South Wales Police Force to have them action an appropriate response. So what's the point? On the flip side, what are some of the potential negative outcomes? Could this register be misused by a jaded ex-partner in law enforcement to track someone down? It's happened before. Could this information be sold to criminal organisations? With more user access, it would make it substantially harder to track down the source of a leak. It's certainly possible. In my opinion, the less people that have access to my firearms records, the better. Privacy and security should be our number one priority. We'll address the statement of improved firearms training in Policy 15.3. 12. The development, with appropriate right of appeal and protection of privacy, of the most stringent mechanisms to ensure that those who are not a fit and proper person to possess a license will not get one. We already have a system in place for this. They're called background checks. They include mental health and police history. Do you know who doesn't have background checks? Criminals. During the application process, if you're flagged as a potential threat, you will be required to undertake a mental health assessment. This isn't just a one and done process. If the psychologist isn't satisfied with your mental health state or your intentions, this assessment process can take numerous visits over many months. And you're not guaranteed a mental health clearance at the end. While I agree with having the safeguards in place, it can take a toll on the applicant, not only through the stress and frustration of being labelled a liability, a flag which lacks situational context may have occurred when the person was young and stupid. It also has a financial impact. This isn't a bulk billed service. The applicant is charged a full rate per hour for time with a private psychologist, and that's why many throw their hands up in the air and give up. So is this a process sufficient? I think so. 13. Tighter legislated minimum standards for the refusal and cancellation of licenses, including 13.1. Conviction of violent offences within the past 5 years. I don't necessarily have an issue with this statement. The person in question was the aggressor. But there's a problem with the wording. It could be applied to people who have acted in defence of themselves or another. For this policy to be applied in a fair and reasonable manner, we would need to address the way our legislation and courts deal with these matters. The person should not have to respond to an act of violence with equal or lesser force. If they go beyond that threshold, pending the severity of their actions, they should not be charged. If you find yourself in a fair fight with someone who is perpetrating an act of violence, you've put yourself in a bad situation. This applies to the general public as much as it does for the police. And that's why they're issued with pistols and tasers. Contrary to what many social justice warriors think, things escalate quickly. And for the most part, your response is instinctual. You don't have time to stop and ponder the consequences. There's been numerous cases in both armed and unarmed situations where a person has acted in the best interest of themselves and the community. In return, they face jail time, the loss of business, breakdown of the family unit, mental health issues, and in some cases, they've taken their own life. I guess no good deed goes unpunished. Let's address both of these factors. Stop charging people for the act of self-defense. Limit access to firearms for those who are a genuine threat to our community. 13.2. Being subject to an apprehended or domestic violence order within the past 5 years. If a person has been found guilty of an offence with sufficient evidence to support the claim, they should not hold a firearms licence. Period. But there's another matter that needs to be rectified in our court system. That is, the implementation and consistent use of harsh punishment for those who make unsubstantiated and false claims of domestic violence. We'll go further into this point later on. 13.3. Mental or physical fitness. I've addressed the current standard of mental health in point 12, so I'll skip ahead to physical fitness. This is one of the more intelligent strategies that Greens have attempted to use to reduce the overall number of licensed firearm owners. Many people who participate in competition target shooting are advanced in age. They're old. As with the majority of firearms owners, shooting isn't just an activity, it's their passion. By engaging in these activities in an age bracket where your options are severely limited, they are given a sense of community and purpose, a small comfort for the remaining years of their life. In my own experiences at the range, this is demonstrated by their willingness to impart education and guidance to younger generations. How to improve your technique, your accuracy, how to identify issues with your firearm or reloaded ammunition, and general chit-chat. The concept of removing a person's sense of purpose to quell your own irrational fears is ridiculous. The assertion here is that older firearms owners may not be able to fend off a potential thief in the event of a home invasion. Well, according to legal precedent, we're not allowed to defend our property, ourselves, or our family anyway. So on the basis of that, physical fitness should not enter the equation. It appears to be a carefully worded attempt at victim blaming. Should we go home every night, barricade our doors, and cower under our beds just in case someone decides to break in? Or do we manage the risk which is present in our own individual circumstances? We secure our firearms, we make wise decisions, and we live our lives. That sounds like a better idea to me. Criminals do horrible things. In majority of the cases, these actions are perpetrated with cars, knives, and other objects that cause blunt force trauma. I've said that already. Maybe we should focus more attention on the underlying cause of violent crimes and less effort on blaming the victims. 14. The abolition of existing minors permits. How do you lower the number of firearm owners in Australia? You remove education, training, and supervised access to firearms to our youth. Instead, you fill their minds with fear and propaganda. Refer back to policy points 4.1, 4.2. What is a minor's permit? A minor's permit allows children to use a firearm under the direct supervision and control of a licensed adult. That's it. They don't have their own safe key, they don't tuck it under the pillow at night time, and as of yet, none have surfaced in the inside of a school bag. They're only able to use the firearm under direct control and supervision of a licensed adult. What is the minimum age requirement for this permit? It varies between states. In New South Wales, a minor permit can be attained from 12 to 18 years old. So, why is this unacceptable to the Greens? Are these children not capable of making intelligent decisions? Let's make some comparisons. A 16-year-old girl is able to fall pregnant, and legally she can make the decision to keep the child, effectively overriding her parents. That's deemed to be acceptable. Young children from around the world are now able to decide upon life-altering surgery to reassign their gender, with parental consent. That is deemed to be acceptable. So on the basis of that, I ask, why can they not undertake an approved training course and safely handle firearms while under direct supervision? Either they are mature enough or they are not. You can't have it both ways. Number 15. All persons seeking a license being required to 15.1. Have no criminal record involving violence, have a character reference from an authorised member of the community, and the right of veto by household members, which is immediate relatives or partners. No criminal record involving violence. We've covered that in point 13.1 and 13.2. Having a character reference from an authorised member of the community. That's an interesting one. How would the system work exactly? Would that be a personal visit by the local police? Would it be a local justice of the peace? Or a self-proclaimed saviour of our community who recently passed a social justice short course? Tell me, how would a perfect stranger be a better judge of character than a member from my local firearms registry who inspects my criminal record or lack thereof. It boggles my fucking mind. As for the character reference, I think there was one country out there that had this policy. Oh yeah, New Zealand. For an international visitor to get a firearms license, they're required to get 2 character references from local residents. In at least one instance, the system was bypassed through online communication, and coincidentally, the firearms registry did not pick up on any discrepancies on these statements during the application process. The result? The events that followed would go down in history as the worst mass shooting New Zealand has ever seen. In conclusion, it's a stupid policy. Let's not make the same mistake. As for the power of a family member to veto your decision to obtain a license. That's right, a license, not the actual firearm. No one should be able to hold that power over you. Not your parents, not your kids, and definitely not your significant other. This is especially true if that person is uneducated or emotionally biased on the matter. This policy is not about promoting safety in the home. It's encouraging people to engage in toxic behaviours. Now, if you do not wish for someone to store a firearm in the family home, that's a different matter. And here's what you do. Discuss it with your partner. Express your feelings in a positive manner and respectfully listen to your partner's point of view. If you're concerned about their intention to use the firearm on yourself or a family member, fucking leave. Look, I understand it's not quite so simple in a domestic violence situation, and I feel for people who are in that position. But shutting down your partner's firearms license application isn't going to solve the problem. If anything, things are about to get much worse. As for the mechanics of the situation, is there a recommended age limit? We seem a little uncertain if kids are capable of that one. Would it be a postal type situation? Can we object in person at the firearms registry, like some type of crazy ex-partner objecting to a wedding? I'd love to be a fly on the wall for that one. 15.2. Undergo a 28-day waiting period to enable check for criminal record, including applications for a second or subsequent firearm. When applying for your firearms license, you must undergo a mandatory 28-day cooling off period. Contrary to popular belief, your license isn't approved at this point. No, the application must then be assessed by registry staff. Some people have waited an additional month. I waited 8.5. So it's safe to say that the firearms registry is actively supporting the Greens policy of making it harder. On top of this initial waiting period, you must then submit a permit to acquire for each firearm that you wish to purchase, obviously pending the category of license you hold and the legality of the firearm. Your waiting period for the first permit to acquire is another 28 days period, minimum. Again, this depends on the efficiency and the backlog of applications in the firearms registry. So after 9.5 months of waiting to own a single firearm, should I then be required to wait another month to purchase a second? No, that's just plain silly. Beyond a quick check to ensure that my firearms license is still valid and has not been revoked, why should I be subjected to additional barriers of entry purely for the sake of it? It literally has zero impact on public safety. Hell, by this point I've already got one firearm. What's to stop me from doing something stupid with that one? Nothing. 15.3. Demonstrate safety knowledge. In order to obtain a firearms license, you're required to undertake an approved training course and complete a written test. This is a demonstration of safety knowledge. Some groups have suggested a practical firing or proficiency component, but how would you be expected to meet this standard before you obtain your firearms license? Especially if the Greens succeed in removing P650 forms, which allows unlicensed person the ability to try shooting activities for themselves to see if they enjoy it. 15.4. Establish good and genuine reasons for possessing a license, i.e., persons with an occupational requirement, like primary producers, other rural purposes, security employees, and professional shooters for nominated purposes, or a member of an approved sports shooting association. In order to obtain a firearms license, you must already submit a genuine reason for ownership. This includes recreational hunting activities, target or sport shooting, and most of the other examples as listed in that policy statement. Now here's the kicker. You've already been approved as having a genuine reason for firearms ownership. Yet, when you submit a permit to acquire, you must submit a second, more specific reason to obtain that firearm. This is despite already proving a genuine reason for firearms ownership. If anything, we should be removing the genuine reason requirement that forms part of the permit to acquire process. 15.5. Undergo tests for licenses conducted by the police or an independent government body rather than by members of a New South Wales Sporting Shooters Association. Do the New South Wales Police, or any other state police agency for that matter, have the capacity and resources to provide this training? Based upon the average state response time, I'd suggest not. Firearms registry staff, in New South Wales at least, are only located at 2 branches throughout the state. So that's not really a practical option either. As far as creating another independent government body goes, is that what our country really needs? More bureaucracy, more wasted taxpayer funds which are funneled into convoluted and efficient systems. How well has this concept worked for us in the past? Maybe a better question to ask would be this: why are members of the New South Wales Sports Shooting Association not considered to be adequately trained for this task? Firearms, at least the ones we're legally able to access in Australia, are a simple mechanical device which is easy to understand. Basic safety concepts, as the name implies, only require a minimal amount of intelligence to absorb. So yet again, why make it more difficult than it needs to be? 15.6. Be required to renew licenses at regular intervals with the payment of a fee to cover government costs, with licenses to be issued for a period of no more than 5 years. So this point is a reference to the Queensland licenses. These licenses allow the applicant to select various time periods of up to 10 years. Is this really a bad thing? If you breach the law, you're going to lose your license, regardless of the expiry date. If you have a mental health check by emergency services, you're probably going to lose your firearms license over that too. So why does the time frame matter? Instead, why not extend the license expiration date to 20 or 30 years and use the additional resources, both time and money, for other purposes, like providing firearm owners with even a basic level of mental health support. Let's follow international research, which dictates that mental health issues have no direct correlation with violence towards others, and let's break that negative stigma. 16. Sale and purchase of firearms and ammunition only through licensed firearm dealers. Licensed firearm dealers, club armourers, gunsmiths, or officers from your local police station. Pending permits. These are the only people who can legally transfer a firearm to one other person. Commercial sale of ammunition has its own set of prerequisites and approvals. However, legally you're able to sell certain calibers of ammunition to other licensed firearm owners, provided they have the correct license. In my opinion, current system seems fairly reasonable, considering the other checks and balances which we've already discussed. Limiting the sale of all firearms, ammunition and parts, I'll group that in two, will destroy the second-hand market. It will also destroy my classifieds website, ozfishandgame.com. Go check it out. With this change, most non-registerable items will be sent to landfill, as dealers will struggle to turn a profit from second-hand gear. Prices will go up, availability will go down, and the Australian firearm owner has another hurdle to jump over. 17. Legislation that allows the sale of ammunition only for the firearms which the purchaser is licensed, with a limitation on the amount of ammunition that can be purchased at any given time. New South Wales already has a similar restriction for pistol calibers. To purchase this ammunition, you must prove that you legally own a firearm which uses that intended caliber. As the mainstream media loves to remind us each and every day, the black market is flooded with illegal handguns. Over the past few months, these handguns have been responsible for a massive surge in gangland shootings. So at what point do we admit this policy doesn't work? As for rifles and shotguns, implementing these same restrictions would be silly, probably because it's easier to purchase and conceal a black market Glock. I don't know. As for placing limitations on the quantity of ammunition that you can possess, just like comparing a car's odometer each year to your neighbours, firearm owners don't consume ammunition at a set rate. Some days, weeks, or months might require more ammunition than others. That could be due to a higher number of hunting activities, competitions, or general range usage. It's not possible to set a purchase or possession limit which satisfies each and every person. Most of this hysteria comes from a once-in-a-blue-moon police raid, which uncovers 1,000+ rounds of ammunition. The ammunition in question, which is mostly .22 caliber, comes in 50 or 100 round boxes. Due to its low price point and limited recoil, most people will burn through 200 to 300 rounds at a range on a slow day. That's why this ammo is bought in big numbers that scare people. Like all shopping, going to the firearms dealer once or twice a week is a pain in the ass. If we all had a Costco type store, we'd be all over it. We aren't buying it for nefarious purposes. We're just lazy. We're just like you. 18. Registration of firearms at the time of purchase, with details to be sent immediately to police for registration. From my understanding, this isn't too far removed from what already happens. I'm just taking a stab in the dark for this one, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. The firearm dealer takes your permit to acquire, writes down your details, you sign the form, the paperwork's completed. At some point during that day, perhaps even straight away in many cases, the details are entered into the firearms registry system and the transfer is complete. As the firearm details have already been assessed by the registry soon after the dealer acquires it, and the person purchasing the firearm has a current permit to acquire and a valid license, it seems a bit funny to demand an immediate notification. Number 19. A ban on mail order sales of firearms and ammunition. First of all, who places a mail order these days? Interestingly enough, that wording was pulled straight from the 1996 National Firearms Agreement. This demonstrates how outdated and backwards our view on firearms ownership truly is. We could maybe update it to say online order, but that statement would be misleading, and here's why. As per point number 16, all firearms must be transferred through a dealer, club armourer, gunsmith, or police station. You cannot mail order these items to your home address. Anyone doing so is acting illegally. The same applies to every state in Australia, perhaps with the exception of Queensland. From what I could tell, and I may be wrong, ammunition can be posted to your residential address, but the sale is made through a licensed firearm dealer and your credentials are checked in full. Number 20. An immediate prohibition on the promotion or the sale of guns and or ammunition on public land or in publicly owned buildings. This is a bit of an odd policy, but I'll have a crack at it. The only assumption I can make here is this policy is referring to the sale of firearms and ammo at an approved firearms range, if it's located on Crown land. Without any context, it's difficult to understand why they put this forth, especially considering they want us to all store our firearms at local club premises. Hold on to your seat for that one. That's coming up in point 24. Again, it's likely been suggested to create another barrier for lawful firearms use. 21. A statewide register of all ammunition bought and sold in New South Wales. From my understanding, the sale of all ammunition and gunpowder must be recorded in New South Wales. These registered are kept at the firearm dealer's premises. A statewide register, accessible by New South Wales Police, would only serve as a security risk to the details of licensed firearm owners. This has happened multiple times now with state firearms registries, including recently with Western Australia and the Western Australian newspaper. Without context of why each person has bought a certain quantity of ammunition, i.e., a club president, a firearms instructor, or a competitive shooter, it is likely these people will be unfairly targeted by New South Wales Police. 22. A prohibition on guns being stored, 22.1, in rural homes without good reason. We have a good reason. In fact, we have at least two. They're referred to as our genuine reasons. One is for a firearms license, and an additional one per individual firearm owned. How many more reasons do we need? 22.2. In urban homes, except where a license is granted for antique gun collectors, defined manufactured prior to 1920, and the guns have been disabled. We've just touched on most of this already, but I'll bite back and give you 4 more reasons. Maintenance, upgrades, use, repair. As far as antiques are concerned, any damage or modification to the item, including disabling the core functionality, will critically reduce the perceived value of the item. That's just how the market works. While a rifle may not hold value to you personally, it does hold value to others in our society. For some, it may be one of the last remaining examples of modern craftsmanship. To others, it may be a family heirloom from a past war, a reminder of sacrifice and bravery from our ancestors to protect those whom they love dearly and those who are left to carry on at home. 23. All ammunition must be stored in locked containers separate from any firearms. This is already a legislative requirement. It applies to both the transportation and storage of firearms and ammunition throughout Australia. 24. Guns in urban areas are to be stored at gun clubs under lock and key, with firing mechanisms kept at designated police stations. This is possibly the dumbest of all firearms policies. Gun clubs aren't located in the middle of a CBD. For the most part, they're located on the outskirts of town, in secluded areas on a few acres of property. Based on their geographical locations, very few, if any, people live in close proximity to a club. That means no one is able to keep an eye out for break-ins or suspicious behaviour after standard business hours. This creates the perfect target for criminals: a large number of firearms, long police response times, and 0 witnesses. It boggles my fucking mind. As for the firing mechanisms, some firing mechanisms cannot be easily removed from a firearm. These may require the assistance from a professional gunsmith. Your average police officer is not capable of this. It is possible to remove parts from certain bolt-action and lever-action rifles, but it should be done so with caution, as inserting the wrong bolt into a rifle can cause serious injury or death. Would you be willing to put your life at risk in the hands of an unqualified stranger? I wouldn't. There's also the matter of safekeeping. It's a common occurrence for items to go missing in police lockup. Drugs, firearms, and money are the most sought after items. Many firearms have been known to disappear and become registered in other people's names months later. It doesn't exactly fill you with confidence, does it? I won't go into the mechanics of how painful this process would be, especially to pest controllers or primary producers. I'm sure you can work that one out for yourself. 25. Regular, unannounced checks by police or another enforcement body ensure that individuals and clubs are abiding by firearm storage regulations. As per my understanding of New South Wales rules, safe inspections are conducted with a minimum 24 hours notice. This ensures that the person will be home at the premises during the allotted time of inspection. Without any concern of mishandling or wrongdoing, what justification would there be for police to suspect a licence breach? If this is done under the pretense of protecting women and children, let me pose the following questions. If you think that it's fair and reasonable to turn up unannounced on the doorstep of a licensed firearm owner, a person with no criminal history or convictions, for the sake of trying to catch them out, would you then consider it to be reasonable to conduct welfare checks on women and children in all households, even with zero history of violence or criminal convictions? After all, we've had an unprecedented rise in domestic violence cases since COVID and the subsequent lockdowns. Hell, here's a middle ground for you. Why not utilise these additional police resources and conduct welfare checks on households that do have a history of domestic violence? Surely that would prove to be a more fruitful exercise. International research has proven that firearms ownership is not a precursor to abuse. Violence is the only precursor to future violence. 26. Enforcement of regulations requiring guns in homes in rural communities to be kept in a metal box with a combination lock securely bolted to a wall or floor, with firing mechanisms and ammunition locked in a similar box in a separate room. External combination locks are garbage. Back in the day, high school that is, we used to reset the pin codes of combination locks and time how long it took for someone else to crack it. Also, bolt cutters and portable grinders have made these locks a minor inconvenience at best. As for our current requirements, all firearms must be secured in a safe which is constructed to a minimum set of standards. Pending your current state of residence, ammunition must be kept in a locked receptacle which is separate to firearms. Some states require bolts to be removed or trigger locks to be fitted. As per point 24, applying a blanket rule to removing all firearms mechanisms is dangerous and unreasonable. It also conflicts with Western Australia's rules which prohibit firearms owners from performing gunsmithing activities on their firearms. 27. The immediate and mandatory police confiscation of all firearms from people who show themselves to be unfit to hold a licence and where a licence has been revoked. This is to apply to both interim domestic violence orders and those who are subject to a domestic violence order. Our legal system is meant to operate under the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, but I do tend to agree with this one. There are 3 factors that would need to be addressed first though. One, if the police are to maintain custody of these items for the duration of a trial, the procedures and the storage facility itself should be overhauled in every police station. As per Policy 24, it's relatively common for firearms and their accessories to conveniently go missing. In some cases, firearms have been found registered in another person's name months or years later. Honestly, a third-party storage facility would be a better option. 2. We need to prosecute those who are found to have made false accusations of domestic violence and do so to the fullest extent of the law. both men and women. The frequency of occurrence is irrelevant. A false accusation not only has the power to destroy access to someone's recreational activities, it has the power to destroy relationships, businesses, reputations, and in some cases, it ends lives. 3. The immediate return of firearms in the event of charges being dropped or a case dismissed. Not 3 months, not 3 weeks, and not 3 days. Immediate. No innocent party should be deprived of their right to own firearms beyond the length of a trial. 28. A permanent amnesty for the surrender of unauthorised firearms and strict penalties for those people found possessing unauthorised firearms. Yes. An amnesty allows members of the general public to hand in unregistered firearms without fear of being prosecuted, provided that we allow firearms dealers and police stations to facilitate this. I fully support it, as do all firearms owners. Why include firearms dealers in this policy? First of all, it removes the fear of being targeted by the police. Many who possess unregistered firearms have criminal records. The last thing we should do is put them in a position where they feel it's safer to hold onto the firearm or carelessly dispose of it, when they could be encouraged to hand it in, risk-free, to a dealer. Secondly, with the exception of automatic firearms, most other small arms can be legally registered within Australia, pending some bureaucratic red tape and the right licence. So why not make the most out of a situation, allow the registration and sale of these items, and add a little financial boost towards our economy? 29. The development of a strict new set of training and testing procedures for all security guards and existing security services being required to meet the new standards. Look, I'm not really familiar with the current standards, nor the scope of what is being currently proposed. However, when we look at the injury and death rates for firearms in a professional setting, one profession seems to eclipse the rest. That's right, the police force. I find the weaponisation of the police for political gain to be a more troubling issue. They do need a broader range and a higher frequency of training, even more so than the average security guard. This doesn't just apply to firearms usage. It should consist of regular training in the use of non-lethal force, like jiu-jitsu. Will this eliminate firearms injury or death in a professional setting? No. Will it reduce the risk of occurrence? Yes, it will. Why is that? Because if you stick a fork into the PowerPoint, you're going to ride the lightning. The same applies to you if you pose a threat to public safety. Number 30. Comprehensive mental health checks must be undertaken before any access to firearms is granted. Should mental health be a consideration when applying for a firearms license? Fuck yes, it should. Should a comprehensive or even regular mental health checks be done for firearms ownership? In my opinion, no. My concern is the slide into regular mental health checks, not out of genuine concern, but purely for the sake of making things difficult. We've touched on mental health in the current process in point 12, so I won't repeat it again. 31. Abandon all political donations from firearms manufacturers, importers, and sellers, as well as associated lobby groups. Why is the firearms industry different from any other industry? It's not. Each product that enters the market comes with a level of inherent risk. It's up to the individual to accept that risk and to make a choice. Will I follow the instructions, the rules, or the law? Will I fail in my obligations to myself and others around me and act in a reckless or dangerous manner? This applies to cars as much as it does firearms. The majority of people do the right thing, but we don't hear about them. It doesn't sell newspapers, attract viewers, or allow them to accumulate votes. That's the core aim of this entire document. To downplay our current legislation, to outrage our people, and to score a cheap, emotionally charged vote on election day. If you want to shut down an industry, do so without restricting their democratic rights. Pose a better argument than what the opposition has provided. Allow our politicians and the general public the ability to weigh up the options and decide for themselves. But maybe I'm wrong. Should politicians decide this restriction is fair and reasonable, I suggest that we shift our attention towards other industries too. Alcohol, tobacco, gambling, and why not throw pharmaceutical companies into the mix while we're at it? For what it's worth, that's a reference to the opioid crisis, but feel free to consider other recent events too. If the concern is truly centred around corruption and the potential risk to public health, let's go beyond these proposed industry restrictions. Let's implement a federal ICAC. Many of the top dogs are implicated in matters that could have far worse consequences than lawful possession of a lever action shotgun with a 6-round magazine. But don't stop there. Why not give every branch of ICAC the power to prosecute those who are found guilty of an offence? The misappropriation and mismanagement of funds are at the top of my list. Money which would have been better spent on our healthcare system, emergency services, or even public roads. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that both corruption and public health and safety can be addressed in many different ways. As with everything, we should focus our efforts on the most pressing issues first, then work our way backwards from there. And the final policy point from the New South Wales Greens Party, 32. Increase resources to random audits of firearm safe storage requirements. Look, it's certainly an option. We could pour money into inspecting licensed and law-abiding individuals, but would we be better off for it? Probably not, because these people aren't committing any crimes. So instead, I'll pose the following questions. Each of these, in my opinion, would be a better use of those additional resources. Let me know what you think. Why don't we use this funding to provide greater mental health support for the demographic that needs it the most? The demographic that is undervalued and most often overlooked. Single fathers and young men. Why don't we give them a sense of purpose and self-worth instead of running them down every chance we get, both in the media and through our social network feeds? If they are stuck in the midst of a mental health crisis, why don't we give them a way out? A reason to work through their issues and past trauma. A path to succeed. Why do we make them choose between their passion of hunting and shooting, key markers which they use to identify who they are as a person and who they are as a man? Instead, why not allow them to safely store their firearms with a licensed friend or family member and assist them in getting the help they so desperately need? Why don't we adjust the way we address domestic violence in the media? Despite the common and equally brutal nature of attacks perpetrated by women, the media only condemns the men. Why is no one asking the question of why that is? Why don't we provide men with subsidised access to legal advice and support in family court matters, instead of allowing solicitors to weaponise loopholes, draw out proceedings, and bleed dry life savings? We are told that all persons are afforded the same rights in a court of law, and that discrimination isn't present. Yet only 21% of fathers are granted 50-50 custody of their children in Australia. Why has this not been addressed? And finally, we sit and discuss the methods of reducing harm in our communities, harsh punishments, tighter new gun laws, and an increased police presence. Yet on average, 21 fathers and an untold number of youth take their own lives each week. Why don't we look at the suicide epidemic in fathers and young men?